how do you think the source material that we have today has survived? Because if you think that the ancient sources that we have now just stayed in place, they were consistently transmitted throughout time, that's not the case at all. And in fact, there's a really good example of that with Pliny the Younger. And I'll get to the trivia about Pliny the Younger, because you may not know this one. In fact, I only discovered it recently when I was doing a bit of research for an upcoming episode for my podcast. And it relates to the two Plinies, because obviously we know that there's two Plinies, right? Pliny the Younger and his uncle, Pliny the Elder. However, this information seems to have got lost, and it was thought for a while that there was only one Pliny. It was only rediscovered, or re-realised as it were, at the beginning of the 14th century, that there were in fact two Plinies, and not just one who did a lot of writing. And this is actually something that points back to what I started with, namely how source material survives. Pliny the Younger is a really good example of this. This is my copy of his letters. Now, if you imagine there was something like this kicking around in, say, the 8th and 9th century AD, no, not really the case. I mean, true, there were fragments and copies of copies. People had been making copies of his letters, but these weren't centralised. And of course, you've got the issue there, which I'll come to, variation, because you have different people making different copies. And in fact, it wasn't until around 1500, so just prior to Henry VIII, that we have the largest amount of his material in terms of his letters, which has survived. And this was found in a manuscript, which itself dated to the 5th century AD. So that's our earliest sort of copies that we have. So a few centuries after he'd actually written anything. And this obviously leads to some problems, because you have lots of different variations, or sometimes several copies of the same letter. And this brings me to the perhaps one of the most famous thing Pliny's known for, and that is the eruption of Vesuvius and the date of the 24th of August as when it happened. Now, we have this because Pliny has it in one of the letters that he wrote. However, we have several different copies of this letter, and it's only evident in a couple of them. It's not in every single copy of that letter. So we don't know if this was something that perhaps a scribe put in because he worked it out, or perhaps he just miscopied something, or there was a mistranslation. It's just not known. It's a sort of Schrodinger's date, as it were. However, that aside, what we do have is fantastic, and Pliny the Younger's letters are well worth a read. Not just about him, but about the world that he presents. You can see a lot of stuff that happens, and I'll be picking that up actually in an upcoming episode of the Ancient History Hound podcast, where I'll be talking about Pliny and his letters. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting.